Hello, everyone. Good to see you. Good morning. It's really a pleasure for me to be in Ljubljana, for this event. This is a place very dear to my heart. This is a place I've been reading about and thinking about and wanting to travel since my early education in the early 90s, when my graduate advisor, Frederick Jameson, was assigning papers and chapters by these people, Mladen Dolar, Slavoj Žižek, Alenka Zupancic. And so it's particularly exciting for me to be here and to have and sort of strengthen bonds with generally the Ljubljana School of Psychoanalysis and Continental Philosophy, and to get to hang out and learn from what I have called before, when in fact Gregor was visiting Princeton, the second generation, working off of a theme from Star Trek, if you'll excuse me, but an important group of new and emerging scholars who I think are also changing the face of critical thinking. And so it's really an honor for me to be here. And I'd like to thank, too, the organizing committee for putting together this event and for inviting me. So, Gregor, you had indicated that I'm supposed to speak for 30 minutes. Is that still true? Okay, good. Mercifully so, right? So this talk is called The World Hysterical Individual. If you're trying to persuade your friends to enjoy Hegel, and who doesn't do that, then don't share his lectures on the philosophy of history. Or maybe rather, you should share this text, but only with your enemies, or say, family members. If that is for their sins, they need to read a theodicy justifying the ways of God to man that rosily presents a narrative of progress in history, that what the past got wrong, the future will get right. Well, those are the cliches about Hegel's philosophy of history, at least. Of course, in such a learned audience, we can feel good together about Hegel and know that these assessments, these cliches, are wrong, but it's not as if we're exactly helped in the matter by the critical traditions reading Hegel that many of us follow. We must admit that even on those occasions when the best minds have worked sincerely with Hegel's philosophy of history, they often find it difficult to take on board all that Hegel says about historical processes or events. Take, for example, the so-called world historical individual, which is Hegel's phrase for a special person in history who overturns the apple cart of the status quo and in so doing creates a commotion of events, a new historical drama, often a tragic one, on the world stage that welcomes a new logic of history, a new dispensation, a new age, indeed, a new universal. It sounds like a compelling idea, and often everyday experience says that this idea checks out in politics, or popular culture, or climate news, the fact that things can change abruptly, and that one day you wake up in a new world. But one cannot help but notice that Hegel's prominent readers act weird about the concept of world historical individuality itself, and will often cite the very concept in order not to talk about it, but rather to talk about something else. That's also weird. For instance, Marx took one look at Hegel's world historical individual and said, "No thanks," and instead rendered this single person into the collective that is the proletariat awakening to history and seizing the means of production, for starters. Lukács, for his part, so loved the idea of Hegel's world historical individual that he talked about novels instead. Adorno takes up an approach to Hegel that is complex and strange, and thus worth raising here just a little bit longer, because in the same way Adorno said in his famous 3 studies that, quote, "In the realm of great philosophy, Hegel is no doubt the only one with whom at times one literally does not know and cannot conclusively determine what is being talked about. So too, in Adorno, one cannot tell whether he's praising Hegel or demolishing Hegel. It often seems that Adorno follows Hegel's ideas faithfully for an entire paragraph until a final fatal sentence where Adorno is consumed by his irrepressibly irascible appetites and proclaims that Hegel got everything wrong. Here, for example, is Adorno talking about the idea of the world historical individual. Quote, "Had Hegel's philosophy of history embraced this current age, Hitler's robot bombs would have found their place beside the early death of Alexander and similar images that Hegel cites in the philosophy of history. And he would have taken these as one of the selected empirical facts by which the state of the world spirit manifests itself directly in symbols. Like fascism itself, the robots move without a subject. Like it, they combine utmost technical perfection with total blindness. And like it, they arouse mortal terror and are wholly futile. I have seen the world spirit," quoting Hegel's famous letter to Niethammer, "not on horseback, but on wings without a head," these robot bombs, and that refutes at the same stroke Hegel's philosophy of history. End quote. I confess I was with Adorno until the final sentence about what refutes Hegel's philosophy of history. Why do these examples refute Hegel's philosophy of history exactly? Why do they not in fact support it? Is it because Hegel couldn't see into the future of world historicality, of world historical individuality, didn't know quite where this concept or a concept like this could lead, perhaps to authoritarianism, if not robot bombs? We will return to this. Meanwhile, with Adorno's references to fascism, terror, and genocide, we get a sense as to what prompts people to look away from Hegel's philosophy as soon as it enters the room. Something about it evokes these references. This has been a very long-standing problem, prompting William Wallace, a well-known translator of Hegel from the 19th century, to proclaim, quote, "Hegel's political thought has sometimes struck students as something apart from the mainstream of Western European political theory, and some have taken him to have championed absolutism, autocracy, and reaction," unquote. Wallace's defense of Hegel didn't matter a whit to later misreaders like Karl Popper, who saw Hegel and who accused Hegel as the antithesis of the so-called open society of liberal democracy. Popper, of course, famously christened Hegel the, quote, "father of historicism and totalitarianism," unquote. And so there we have it. The certain lingering awkwardness about Hegel, his philosophy of history, and to a great extent, of course, his philosophy of right. To be clear, it's not as if these mistaken readings haven't been addressed and debunked by Wallace himself back in the 19th century, or more extensively by Marcuse in Reason and Revolution in the 20th century. But it's useful to keep these statements in circulation, precisely because history repeats itself so much and so forcefully and seems to be getting louder and louder, while at the same time more obnoxious, more ridiculous, and more hysterical in a way that I would argue is strangely comic but deeply dangerous. Next section. Let me say a word about the addition I'll be using, a boring but important consideration that informs my argument and bears on how we read, teach, and write about Hegel's lectures on the philosophy of history. So I'm going to talk about the text itself. For those keeping track at home, I will be using the second edition of the text initially prepared by Eduard Gans in 1837, which includes transcriptions and notes from the philosopher's son himself, Carl Hegel, who incidentally was a medievalist. This text incorporates Hegel's latest material from the winter of 1830-1831 and was published by Carl as a second edition in 1840. This text would be translated by John Siberry and become, for what it's worth, the standard English edition until rather recently. Even if the translation is way off at points, and even though the blue binding of the book will crack if you just look at the thing, the basis of this text is a good one. Why do I mention this business about the text? It's because Hegel's presentation, ideas, and ordering of points in his philosophy of history vary from version to version across the 1820s into 1830 and 1831, not long before his death. The latest version of the text in the Gans and Carl Hegel edition interests me most in the way Hegel economizes his argument in some places and brings out new terms and problems in other places. This late text, I argue, has some distinct political and ideological differences from what you will find in any of the earlier lectures on the philosophy of history, especially differences concerning the idea of the world historical individual. So in the lectures themselves in this last edition, Hegel addresses what makes history. He says that human passions create action, cause events, and makes history. Which is why Hegel plainly declares, quote, "We may affirm absolutely that nothing great in the world has been accomplished without passion, underscore," unquote. When Hegel affirms something absolutely, we know, of course, he means business. Well, he does. He has a lot to say about the passions, first talking about everyday people behaving passionately selfishly and pursuing their private interests with all their might. All of this self-centered activity adds up to a greater good within the state, a familiar notion from Adam Smith, if not Spinoza. Hegel, though, is deeply interested in taking passion to the next level by talking about the world historical individual, whose passion is preternatural and affects the state in a totally different way than the passions of regular people. Indeed, the passionate actions of a world historical individual are inimical to the state itself, with actions that are, quote, adverse to what he calls a, quote, fixed system, actions that, quote, assail and even destroy the state's foundations and existence, unquote. Watch out, state, watch out, world. The world historical individual is coming for you with, quote, a great world historical passion, unquote. Sure, Hegel is an idealist, but he's really thinking at 30,000 feet here. He keeps taking the matter higher and higher. We eventually learn the reason why the world historical individual is so incomparably compassionate, so incomparably passionate. It's because such a person is juiced up on a new universal to make history by breaking history. Hegel explains that in history, quote, these contingencies, these momentous collisions between existing acknowledged duties, laws, and rights realize themselves in history. They involve a universal of a different order from that universal on which depends the permanence of a people or a state. This new universal is an essential phase in the production of the creating idea, of truth striving and urging towards consciousness of itself. Historical men, world historical individuals, are those in whose aims such a new universal lies, unquote. This paragraph is larded with universality, and it is here that Hegel first introduces the very term world historical individual, saying with due emphasis once more that the permanence of the state cannot be guaranteed when such a player, such a figure emerges. This passage, in fact, is key because it conveys the sense that a character portrait is on the way. All this talk about historicality and universality makes us crave an example and ask Hegel, whom do you mean? Who is our mystery guest for today? Here's where my boring talk about additions, versions, and revisions comes into play. For only in the last version of these lectures does Hegel immediately follow his aforementioned claim about the great individual pumped up on universality, channeling the world spirit unbeknownst to him, does he name a name. He gives us an example, and that name is Caesar. And it just so happens that Hegel's first example of the world historical individual is an autocrat, according to Hegel. So here's a quotation. Caesar was contending for the maintenance of his position, honor, and safety. And since the power of his opponents included the sovereignty over the provinces of the Roman Empire, his victory for him secured the conquest of that entire empire. And he thus became, though leaving the form of the Constitution, the head of state. That which secured for him the execution of a design, which in the first instance was of negative import, the autocracy of Rome, So this translation is wonky and I'm going to interrupt it. He secured the autocracy of Rome. This was at the same time independently necessary feature in the history of Rome and in the history of the world. So I'll stop there. I don't think Hegel can be mistaken here, for there is a certain clarity to Hegel's predication of the term world historical individual. Sure, everyone understands Caesar to be great, but not every commentator will say he was an autocrat. And among those commentators, Hegel himself came only late to this position in describing him as an autocrat in his lectures on the philosophy of history. And this lateness was an interesting time in terms of what he was working on and revising. For example, while touching up the philosophy of history, late in life, he was doing revisions on the philosophy of mind, the third part of his Encyclopedia of Philosophical Sciences, where too we find him saying that the Romans messed up and that their autocracy is tyranny. Moreover, in the earlier versions of these same lectures on the philosophy of history, Hegel would only name, unfortunately, non-European forms of governance, like African polities, as autocratic despotisms. But he is now describing autocracy as one of the societies that's at the heart of Western jurisprudence and self-fashioning. Indeed, at the heart of a renaissance of modernity, into modernity. As they say, all paths lead to Rome. Once upon a time, Hegel would never characterize Once upon a time, Hegel would never characterize Caesar this way, and now he does. So we know why autocracy is even in the same contemporary critical conversation as Hegel's world historical individual. It's because Hegel says it himself. But are we making the right conclusions about what this means and what Hegel meant by it? Back to our boring task of additions, versions, and revisions to spot a wrinkle in the fabric of the Hegelian philosophy of history. By comparing the various parallel texts of the philosophy of history across the years, we can track what's missing and what else is new. We find that as Hegel revises, he has a tighter grip on the qualitative or moral assessments of the world historical individual. For example, in his final revisions after the second draft of 1830, Hegel removed these words, proclaiming that world historical individuals have, quote, right on their side, and that, quote, whatever they do is right, unquote. Likewise, he keeps a fairly close eye on his choice of adjectives to describe world historical individuals, especially that concerning what is good, gut, and what is great, gross. These terms have always seemed to have a kind of pseudo-grammatical relationship, as if they were comparatives involving each other. Think of the slogan, quote, why settle for something good when you can have something great? Full disclosure, I made up that slogan, or so I thought, but when I Googled it, it shows it to be the motto of a handsome multi-billion-dollar real estate investor and motivational speaker. Not me, in other words. Anyway, one may impute a moral value to both terms equally, the good and the great, but that would be wrong. It is true that Hegel is fast and loose with the term great or gross to mean that world historical individuals go big or go home. That is, they do something immense on a grand scale. He never says, however, that their deeds are good, for that would clearly posit a moral evaluation he does not wish to assign here. In fact, good is a term Hegel reserves explicitly for regular old people whose individual interests and self-centered passions add up to a larger good that is not, in fact, universal history and therefore not great, not on that scale of events. Where Hegel says any aspect of world historical individuality is good is exactly at that point where he shifts the focus from the individual as actor doing this or that to the world spirit as the agent that inevitably makes history. So we would think, okay, yes, now world spirit, that's going to be good. But in the process, he only says that this process of world spirit may seem good or can appear good, scheinen kann. He opines that, quote, new historic possibilities which conflict with the existing system and violate it or even destroy its very foundations may well appear good and for the most part essential and necessary, unquote. Why does this conflict this destroying of the foundations of the existing system, the current state, seem good? And why is this a question of seeming or appearance anyway? Why not just say it is good? Hegel won't even say that in certain terms, and not specifically in philosophical terms, in which what matters isn't the past or the future, but what, quote unquote, is. This section is called The Policy of Personality. Hegel, in putting Caesar exactly where he is in his new spot in the late lectures on the philosophy of history, implies, or rather outright declares, that autocracy is the inevitable outcome of world historical individuality when such intense individuality is scaled up to the level of a polity, when the personal, in this sense, is made political. We know this because elsewhere in some material transcribed by Georg Lassen in 1826 and 1827, Hegel tells us how autocracies form when, quote, individual subjects become isolated from one another, when they become atomized, fragmented into numerous individual personalities within the state, with the consequence that, still quoting, the state no longer confronts the individual personalities as an abstract entity, but as the power of an autocrat over the individual citizens, unquote. Thus, quote, Hegel continues, still quoting, an arbitrary power comes into play, counterbalanced by internal insurgency as the pains of despotism make themselves felt, unquote. Hegel also, in returning to our major text, the philosophy of history, explains that when a state is formed after the family, when a state is ruled by a royal family in which each individual member surrenders their personality to merge into the single person that is the head of the state, that is the family, you get a theocracy. So a lot of these problems of personality seem to go nowhere or go nowhere, quote unquote, good. You can hear how these problems of personality enter into the conversation about autocracy and theocracy. This is interesting because personality itself is a central consideration in authoritarian rule, such that we have a concept in later critical theory and philosophy called the authoritarian personality. I raise this problem of personality because Hegel speaks of the world historical individual also as a personality. In other words, my quotes just now weren't even getting to world historical individuality, so just wait for it. So he asks, quote, what is the material in which the ideal of reason is wrought out? The primary answer would be personality itself, human desires, subjectivity generally, unquote. So we have to think on what it means for a personality to be world historical. The significance of personality, I would argue, is this, that it is from the personality that, owing to its world historicality, flows some kind of knowledge or hunch or sense about how to put your finger to the wind to assess the direction of history, the flow of the new universal, how best to conduct affairs, how to lead, how to rile people up, how to transform the state by refusing to heed what state persons traditionally prescribe to political leaders in the first place. Namely, they advise leaders to heed their counsel and advice, and it's usually bureaucrats or court figures insisting upon this form of statecraft. Here is Hegel, quote, whatever prudent designs and counsels the world historical individuals might have learned from others, those would be more limited and inconsistent features in their career. For it was they, the world historical individuals, who best understood affairs and from whom those others learned and approved, or at least acquiesced in their policy, unquote. Okay, so the news is in. The world historical individual is no statesperson, and as Hegel further indicates, quote, they were practical and political people, unquote. You could say, as Hegel says, that world historical individuals have no idea what they are doing, or rather, quote, no consciousness of the general idea they were unfolding while prosecuting those aims of theirs, unquote. Yet these personalities are leaders. They can lead thanks to their apparent charisma, their personality, and gravitational subjectivity that is large enough to channel world spirit and contain a new universal in the first place. The result is that people fall into line. when the world historical individual enters the scene. Hegel paints a vivid picture of this process, saying that, quote, people follow these soul leaders, Seelenführer, for they feel the irresistible power of their own inner spirit thus embodied, unquote. And here is where some new problems begin to emerge in what feels like Hegel's proto-construction of the authoritarian personality, following on from his marks about autocracy and world historical individuality. This is the point that Hegel leaves things open, and by default leaves it to us to decide where to go from here. That's because Hegel is only looking in one direction. His examples of world historical individuals like Alexander the Great or Caesar are from the past, or from the recent past, like Napoleon. So what sort of prognostication, what sort of future can be opened up in a consideration of the world historical individuals? We should bear in mind that there is an antithesis or split between the state and the world historical individual, not only in the way the world historical individual destroys or deforms the state, as we already saw, or the way in which the world historical individual assumes the state for himself in autocracy, but there's also the manner in which, for Hegel, one entity, the state, has a future, and the other entity, the world historical individual, does not. We can sit here and talk all day about future forms of polity, future formations of the state, and there are whole disciplines in political theory devoted to this, as there are whole branches of imaginative writing by the name of science fiction, to say nothing of this or that manifesto in architecture and the various expressions of world-making and world-building at all scales, from virtual realities to utopian theorizing. But it's another thing to think a future for the world historical individual, and it's curious that Hegel doesn't attempt this, not even alluding to futurity as he seems to do in his wager about what sort of state would be ideal, or for that matter, the way in which he predicts the end of art, to such an extent that one prominent Hegelian proposes that the art that Hegel means to come to an end is modernist abstract painting. Even absolute knowledge feels to be a space and time to come. But for Hegel, the world historical individual has no future, and accordingly, Hegel had reached a stumbling block, which I think is a good thing, if not something of a relief. Why? Because what is it that you see when you look into the future of world historical individuals, those soul leaders from whom others feel the irresistible power of their own inner spirit thus embodied, unquote? You see what Hegel had already said about the past. You see autocracy, you see authoritarianism. Both Adorno and Hannah Arendt saw this future that was their own historical present in real time. Both have insight into the futural form of world historical individuality that Hegel refused and that goes by the newer name of the authoritarian personality. For both these thinkers, too, authoritarianism marks a split or distinction between the state and the authoritarian personality, as we saw in Hegel's theorization of the world historical individual. But for Adorno and for Arendt, this difference is finally collapsed, with personality emerging, as could be easily guessed, as the dominant element in the relationship between personality and state. According to Arendt in The Origins of Totalitarianism, personality is policy. Personality is policy because policy itself limits authoritarian improvisation and its perverse freedoms. Accordingly, authoritarian leaders dislike official policy and party platforms and prefer to rule by decree, which keeps civil servants, in other words, career people in government, all the people whose professional lives are bound up with advice giving and policy papers, it keeps them guessing and scrambling to make policy out of extemporized declarations from the authoritarian. This state of chaos assures that followers are impassioned and ginned up by an anything-goes authoritarian agenda that remains agile and responsive to their feelings and demands. This state of chaos is enough to create a movement. Now, of course, Arendt wrote decisively about the demographic policy of Nazi Germany, but her point was that genocide emerges from what fundamentally isn't policy, but pre-existing sentiment among the public: fear of Jews, hatred of religious, ethnic, and racial minorities, hatred of people with mental disabilities. The point is the authoritarian realizes that to create and sustain a movement, he needs to keep fears in motion in a space outside of policy programs and beyond the political party. Marcuse concluded similarly in determining that, quote, fascism is bound by no principles. Change of course to keep step with the changing constellations of power is its sole unchanging program, unquote. So I want to transition to this formation of the world hysterical individual in my final section. Because my point is simply this. On the question of what makes an authoritarian, Hegel put into place many of its elements in the distinction between policy and personality and the emphasis on passions and extemporization, and he gave these things no future. You could say that he removed them from history, in other words. And he did so in a way that was self-aware and critical, even if he did this in light of circumstances that had yet to experience how truly dark human history can be. Indeed, if Hegel refuses the futurity of the world historical individual for these and other reasons, he did contemplate one specific future when it came to world history, that of the United States, which he names as, quote, the land of the future, where in the ages that lie before us, the burden of world's history shall reveal itself, unquote, with apologies. He continues saying that, quote, as the land of the future, America has no interest for us here. For as regards history, our concern must be with that which has been and that which is. In regard to philosophy, on the other hand, we have to do with that which, strictly speaking, is neither past nor future, but with that which is, unquote. So is the future finally now? Please understand that none of what I'm about to say intends to equate Germany in the 30s and 40s with the US now, nor for that matter present-day authoritarianisms with anything transpiring in the US, so much as I wish to put forth a point about policy and personality and the new domains into which that personality with authoritarian impulses extends. This is the problem when you work on authors. You have authors who, well, they seem like authoritarians too sometimes. Literature and Heresy in the Age of Chaucer. To that end, and towards a conclusion, I'd like to make good on my title and point to an important insight by Adorno, who in this case isn't writing about Hegel, so his comment isn't contradictory or confusing or fickle. Adorno says plainly that, quote, fascist leader types are frequently called hysterical, unquote. Now, why is that? Here's Adorno again. Quote, such leaders know no inhibitions in expressing themselves. They function vicariously for their inarticulate listeners by doing and saying what the listeners would like to hear, but either cannot or dare not say. Such fascist-type leaders violate the taboos which the middle-class society has put upon any expressive behavior on the part of the normal, matter-of-fact citizen. The so-called common people have all unfailing flair for the genuine and the sincere and disparage fakeness or fakery, and the translation's weird. Hitler liked, still Adorno, Hitler was liked not in spite of his cheap antics, but just because of them, because of his false tones and his clowning. They observed as such, and they appreciated him for doing so. Now, that's the end of the quote. So I wonder if this type of authoritarian personality, this kind of clowning, has grown over the decades into a new type of comic character for which comedy is the vehicle for authoritarian expression, persuasion, charisma, and oddly enough, perverse humanization of the autocrat. Let me speak of what I know and have observed, which was the daily carnival act known as the 45th president of my country, A1, Donald Trump, between 2016 and 2020. I've come to wonder whether this man adopts the comedic performance techniques of the authoritarian personality alongside his already documented effort to emulate authoritarians in other ways. The whole story is a comedy, a joke that is and isn't funny. To begin with, this is a man who decided to run for political office, to run for the presidency after being humiliated by Obama, who made Trump the butt of jokes at a prominent media celebration in Washington, D.C., while Trump sat in the audience. Sure, there's much to make fun of with Trump's image and odd self-fashioning, such as it is, But his way of deflecting criticism is to joke, cock his head this way and that, raise his eyebrows, and shrug off responsibility for his words. It seems to me that, thanks to him, jokes function in political discourse in the US in a new way. In other words, this is not the usual practice of joking about power as a way of, quote unquote, speaking to power, as done from time immemorial. Rather, the so-called jokes issue from or are told by the power itself, to where the joke's on you oftentimes, on some subject conjured from thin air, a stereotype of one racial minority or another, and jokes that aren't funny but yet still have the structure of a joke. There's something inevitable about certain kinds of authoritarian personality to spend time clowning around rather than pushing or developing policy. As above, the authoritarian tendency or authoritarian personality doesn't think in terms of policy. And this is a consistent theme in Trump's political life. His whole campaign was a joke in comparison to all the other campaigns, and political commentators in the news would dismiss this, assuring people not to take Trump seriously because he had no policy and could therefore never win the election. And of course, many didn't take him seriously because they thought he was a joke and totally unseriously, and that is precisely how he won. And really, it's precisely how he lost, with 74 million US citizens thinking a second term of the Trump administration would be a good thing. 74 million. His success comes from sowing chaos at all levels, saturating the media with jokes of all kinds, with different rhetorical designs, from basic cursing and obscenities to declarations about his penis size, to circulating images of his head photoshopped onto the muscular body of Sylvester Stallone as Rocky Balboa, which is the most ridiculous chimera you could imagine, but somehow is inspiring to his base of voters. He jokes about confident, high-achieving women like Elizabeth Warren, and be sure, I'm not a Democrat and not a fan of these people. I don't know if that's clear or not, but I just want to say he jokes about high-achieving people like Elizabeth Warren, who famously, quote, had a plan for that. That was one of her campaign slogans. I have a plan for this, I have a plan for that. In other words, a policy prescription for what ails the US. Policy schmolicy. And he won against Hillary Clinton because many voters, not just Trump voters, viewed her as a technocratic policy maven. Finally, there's a last form of joke which needs consideration, and it's the unfunny one-liners that rewrite history itself, as when he frequently claimed that some idiotic remark of his or other was just a joke, was just sarcasm, as in his line at a presidential debate, quote, Russia, if you're listening, unquote, find Hillary's emails, or his joke that he would like to emulate Xi Jinping and consolidate power, or his joke that he would never leave office, ever. I was just joking, he says. These are jokes, which is itself the joke. On whom, though? What are these jokes? There are many answers here, as there are as many dangling and loose threads in my argument. But I see a trajectory from the world historical individual to the world hysterical individual by such an example. Thank you.
Boo. Thank you, Andrew. Thank you very much for this wonderful talk. You've given us a lot of food for thought, and I want to immediately open for questions. So, questions, comments. We have one right there. Francis?
Oh, thank you very much. I really learned a lot from your talk. But I was wondering about hysteria, or the term hysterical, from the beginning, and you don't say too much about that. So I was thinking about hysteria from a psychoanalytic point of view, but I don't think you have that in mind. And I was just wondering, don't you mean hilarious?
Yeah. I do, and the problem is that I mean, I did think about this,
Okay.
and I did do my homework, and the problem is hysteria. Okay, first of all, in this room, I want to be honest, I'm probably the last person you want to hear talk about hysteria.
Okay.
But just to say, you know, when looking at Lacan, and like there's every point in his career, the early, middle, and late Lacan changes his definition of hysteria, and I can't quite track it and grab a definition of hysteria that I'm satisfied with, starting with the definition of the split subject, say, just that simple formulation. And I thought about that in relation to the world historical individual as a split subject in a weird way, split between individual passion and world spirit universality. And I thought that was interesting. But then I felt like I was losing the thread as Lacan refines the definition and the ways in which the term also has a gendered valence, which of course I didn't discuss at all either. And you have to believe me, I wanted to work that angle in. And I think the way I cheat and work it in, and I have a whole extra thing on psychology and which is not psychoanalysis that Hegel also talks about, which is very interesting. But what I was trying to do through Adorno, who sort of, his version of psychoanalysis is a kind of Freudian version, and he's fast and loose with his terms, like hysteria, was just to kind of bring the idea of the fascist leader and that general pop, lowercase psychoanalytic sense of hysteria as the hysteria of the authoritarian leader or mass hysteria around authoritarianisms, drawing, like, for instance, from kind of these elemental forms of Freudianism and psychoanalysis having to do with taboos, like stuff in Wilhelm Reich, for instance. That thread, I just wasn't really quite able to work it out, and I hope that over the conference, at least I can have a conversation with someone who will tell me what to think. Maybe you can.
Well, if I had to say one short thing about it, from a Lacanian point of view,
Yes,
I would say that the hysteric wants to be the object of the other's desire, and that could actually fit.
Can you see, see, this is the thing. Jameson said that, so I went through and was looking, okay, who are my people and who said what about world historical individuality? And Fred's my boy, he was my teacher. So he just simply said that the world historical individual is kind of a channel through which emerges something like a big other, right? And would you see the universality of world spirit as a big other? That's where I was kind of like, am I forcing it too much? Is the idea of the big other useful in that way?
But I don't know, but I don't think that would have to do with hysteria.
Right, yeah, I think that's right. So I thank you for that.
All right. So I'm sure we have another question or comment already. If not immediately, I have a question for you, Andrew, which is, how do you see the relationship between another concept that Hegel uses, which is the concept of the monarch, which clearly isn't someone who is good or bad, and absolutely not someone who is great, but still someone who Hegel would propose as a kind of a solution for a political commonwealth. So how do you see the relationship between world historical individual and a monarch? Do you see that as in lectures on the history of philosophy? Hegel, I think, when he talks about Caesar, he kind of indicates the idea of Rome being ruled by one. So he's clearly suggesting some sort of monarchic element in Caesar. He doesn't speak so much about autocracy there. He speaks about monarchy, basically. So what's your take on that?
Well, I was alluding, at one point in this, I was alluding to his statement. And you know about this, Gregor has a wonderful article on the theatricality of power in a 2020 issue of Problemi, which I want you to check out, which I was looking at trying to think about a question that's like this. And you talk about this, but that, Hegel at one point in a few places, but in the philosophy of history, talks about monarchy as a kind of example of an ideal state in some way, but a passive monarchy that is independent of the two powers or independent bodies that he calls the aristocracy and the democracy. And it's a kind of very vague formulation. And so your question is if I've understood it right, is how is the monarch an example of, or could be seen as an example of a world historical?
Yeah, I mean, I would suppose it probably cannot possibly be an example of that.
I think so for the reasons that you say, and I think this is a trick question. I think you're trying to see if I read your piece. But I think you're right in this because you point out, I mean, and it's part of what I'm saying here too, actually, and in fairness to myself, but that these two things don't mix. There is no state form for world historicality.
Exactly.
A world historical individual cannot be. How do we talk about Caesar as a monarch in that way, right? And it really gets complicated. There's a lot more complexity here, and I can make it a short statement, but and this is some of the work that you're involved with too, just reading treatments and depictions of Julius Caesar, like Shakespeare's, for instance,
Right.
and kind of getting absorbed into that world where you start liking the autocrat, and
Yeah, well, I personally think this is one of the big questions of political theory. Why do we like them?
Right,
or
right.
why do some people, like 70 million
Yeah,
people
yeah.
in some cases, like them? All right, I didn't want this to be about me.
No,
so
that's an interesting question. Thank
let's
you.
move on. So, who's next? I have more questions, so if you're not going to raise your hand, I can shoot. Don't worry about that.
you can call on people too. I think that's within your autocratic authority too.
That is within my power, correct. So, really? You're going to give me another chance? All right. The other question I had for you was more about word historical individual in the sense that, I mean, you talked about this, and it's very convincing, I think, the question of how does personality correspond to histories, like the historic individuality. And this is a point where I think Hegel is, to me, confusing. I'm not sure whether I fully understand what he's trying to say. And also, you've made a very good point about how personality becomes something really important for Arendt and Adorno. But I wonder whether a person like Caesar is someone who becomes a world historical individual because of, his personality. Because is it his fault? Is it Caesar's fault that the history changed? Or is it that simply he happened to be, someone called Julius Caesar happened to be at the right time, at the right moment, and then things changed? But they would have changed in any way and would have a different name to talk about.
That whole thing about they would have changed anyway, which bespeaks to the necessity of history, is really important. I'm trying to find if there are other conversations about this, but when reading the lectures on the philosophy of history, it seems to me that section especially is very much an engagement with Kant's moral philosophy, particularly the groundwork of the Metaphysics of Morals and the later volume, The Metaphysics of Morals. And what he is working on there is there are so many term for term, sentence for sentence correspondences between Hegel and Kant on that. And I think what he's trying to do is get at this question of how history inevitably, ineluctably brings an individual to the world stage. But Hegel wants to problematize that. How? In about 15 pages before getting to the world historical individual, he talks about ordinary individuals and the morals, or let's say ethics, of containing your passions and whether or not we can think about a thing like a kingdom of ends, whether we should treat other people as means rather than ends, just all the things that make it where individuals don't behave like jerks, like a-holes, right? And that conversation is about putting the emphasis on individuals having a choice. Hegel says that individuals know what is good conduct. Individuals know that we are law-making entities by birth. Individuals know that there are other people. Individuals have theories of other minds, okay? And so it's within that frame that suddenly here's this other kind of individual. And it seems to me what Hegel is saying by reworking Kantian philosophy is he's trying to he's trying to put it within a negative frame, to say that it's not just history brought this person forward, it's that this person made choices to be this person, breaking certain moral and social laws to become that person. Like, I'm not of the school, in other words, that world historical individuality is necessary. I feel that it is contingent.
Okay.
You know.
Thank you very much. This is very clear. We have another question here.
Thank you, Andrew.
I was following the microphone. Okay. Thank you, Bara.
Yeah, I have one question about this person. As far as I understood, Hegel in his phenomenology of spirit, he has a quite clear, makes a quite clear difference between an individual and a person. Person is meant to be an empty, soulless, abstracted thing. Mm-hmm. And it refers to abstraction of an individual in a legal status. And I think, I was thinking about this because I will also touch upon this in my talk. I think one of the problems of today's world, we have many, is also that these persons, so we are like considered to be persons, addressed as persons, which actually means that we are all just abstracted. We count nothing. But what is like subversive, maybe here in today's society, that this speech about persons is addressed to us as if it is speech about us as individuals. So that this might be like a problem of today. So we talk about, for example, personalization of things, which is kind of like as if something is made concrete, very specific, particular for one individual, but actually it's just the other way around. And just maybe just a small, personal detail to this. When my daughter was born, when I came from the whatever. So when I came home from the hospital, I got a letter from the tax office that they are very happy. They want to from the tax office to Mrs. Minia Jauszowicz, who was my daughter, 3 days old, that they kindly remind her that she's not inscribed into the tax.
The tax authority.
Yeah. Tax authority.
They had something to say for my child as well. Yes, absolutely.
Okay, this is it.
Oh, well, I was rather liking that story. Sorry for you, but yes. No, this is brilliant, and I would say if I could bundle that up, there's a section of this that I had referred to, but I should say a lot more about it, but this discourse of personalization, this reification of the individual into a person that is abstract individuality, which Hegel says not only in the phenomenology of spirit, but in the philosophy of right, in the philosophy of history, et cetera, I can give you a passage, but that is the discourse of authoritarianism and autocracy. That sounds a little heavy because it's got a light touch to it. Oh, the personal. It's does a violence to an idea that the personal is political, that if we personalize, we're engaging into a form of politics. That's, I think, a great thing to have disrupted these ideas of the personal, the idea that we are these abstractions rather than anything special at all. Because as soon as you start thinking you're special, then I start yawning.
All right, thank you very much.
But you are special, Bara, but nobody else.
All right, thank you very much. We'll use this. Oh, there's another question.
There is.
Hello, my breakfast
Hi,
friend.
yes, I'm happy to see that you've...
This is my breakfast friend.
You've made it, yeah. Thank you for that great talk. I had another suggestion, maybe another way of thinking about Hegel here as somehow reworking some Kantian ideas, and that would be actually, I think, a good way to sort of open up your problematics would be to think through the idea of the genius.
Yeah.
Since the genius, of course, a classic case of philosophical misnomer is an idiot. The genius famously expresses nature to the extent that it goes beyond understanding by producing what Kant calls aesthetic ideas, namely things that go from intuition to concept. They inspire reflection because they are somehow opaque, unclear. We feel there is some meaning there that we cannot quite get. So that's the function of the genius. And I think it's not a bad analogy to the world historical individual who, and especially if we emphasize this idea of a world stage, he supplies us with this mysterious signifiers. The very mystery as to what is so great about him is what does the work. And then the question rather becomes, and the only answer to that can be Hegelian, what's actually the difference? Like, what's the distance traveled from Napoleon to Trump? It seems much short, and it seems as if we now just, as Hegelian would say, things have finally become what they have always been. We now see it in its sort of pure emptiness. We see that the genius is an idiot. That would be a way of putting it.
Trump called himself a
Very stable genius in a moment of stupefying brilliance and idiocy at the same time. Exactly.
Yes, I believe, Eric, you also had a very good brain. I have a great brain. There is a lot of interest in, yeah, I mean, first of all, that's just absolutely wonderful, so I'm writing that down. The second thing is Hegel, I feel like this needs more work, but it's strange. When Hegel takes policy away from the world historical individual, when he takes away the pressures of culture and conduct and moral behavior and the prescriptions for that counsel gives to the world historical individual, and while on the other hand he also says that repeatedly that the world historical individual doesn't know what he's doing. He's constantly talking about, and the Sibri translation is not that great because there's sort of like a misdirect there and uses the word unconscious. But what's being said there really is non-consciousness, just sort of non-awareness. And so it feels like there's something of a spontaneous character to the world historical individual in that sense. And I would like to equate that with a kind of idiocy without trying to sound like I'm some kind of like neoliberal technocrat. And again, I want to clarify all that stuff. Maybe I look like one or play one on TV, but that's not where I'm going with this. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. At this point, the time our true Lord and Master is pressing us to end here, and thank you.
Thank you, Gregor. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Thank you.